The SNES. Just what a machine, you know? To this day, it remains my favorite Nintendo console of all time. Actually, you know what? It may just be my favorite console of all time, although there are a couple modern consoles that do give it a run for its money. If the NES helped introduce me to gaming, then the SNES cemented a love of gaming in my heart forever. That's super cheesy, but we're gonna keep it. Okay, that's how we're gonna start it. Okay, so when I started this series, over a year ago now, I intended for each video to focus on a specific console generation. This was pretty easy to do with the third generation because really the NES was the only console I had any experience with. No one around me had a Master System or an Atari 7800. But with the fourth generation, I realized I was in a tough spot. While I had a Super Nintendo, my older brother had a Sega Genesis. In my group of friends, it was about a 50-50 split between those who had Nintendo's offering and those who preferred Sega. Then there was Keith. Keith had a TurboGrafx 16. Nobody really talked to Keith. Kinda smelled like cabbage a lot of the time. On top of the home consoles, there were also the portables. The Game Boy is what most of us had, but there were a few of my friends who had Game Gears. Keith had an Atari Lynx. This effing guy. Anyways, that's a lot of ground to cover, so I decided to break the fourth generation into 3 parts. This video is going to be all about the SNES, obviously that's the title of the video. The next video is going to be about the Sega Genesis, and the last video will be about the portable games that came out during this time period, which will segue nicely into the 5th generation since the Game Boy had just a stupidly ridiculous multi-generational lifespan. Let's set the stage for the Super Nintendo coming into existence. It's the 80s, and at this point, it's really hard to overstate Nintendo's dominance over the video game market, especially by the late 80s. By the end of 1988, the company owned 80% of the market share in the North American video game market. That was a market the company had almost single-handedly resurrected with its launch of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Sure, NEC had introduced Japan to the superior 16-bit graphics of the PC Engine in 1987, and Sega launched its Mega Drive in October of 1988, but despite their objective superiority and the PC Engine's sales success, they had failed to make too much of a dent in Nintendo's superiority. By 1989, both NEC and Sega brought their 16-bit offerings, well, mostly 16-bit offerings, to the North American market, but Nintendo wasn't too concerned, with system sellers like Super Mario Bros. 3 still on the horizon. Nintendo saw no reason to rush the release of the successor to the NES, so it was the SNES didn't launch until November of 1990 in Japan and 1991 in North America. The rest of the world wouldn't see the system until 1992, and this strategy may have actually served Nintendo well, if it wasn't for Tom Kalinske and his crack team at Sega of North America. Their marketing allowed Sega to barrel ahead in the market, giving the SNES an uphill battle to fight from its launch in North America.
Genesis does
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free.
Genesis does.
What Nintendo?
That's more a story for the Genesis retrospective, but it's worth mentioning here, because the console war this rivalry instigated is, in my opinion, the reason the SNES had as many incredible titles as it did. Both companies were giving it all they had, pushing in-house developers to deliver exclusive, unique experiences, and wooing as many third-party developers as they could to supply their console with high-quality, unique titles. Of course, this rivalry meant that children of the 90s had to do what children of all ages have done. They had to choose a side and defend it with the irrational rapidity that only children seem to possess. And certain fandoms. I fought in the 96th Koopa Brigade, which saw major action in the Western US theater. So what was it about the Super Nintendo that garnered my undying devotion? Chance. Just pure chance. You may remember that in my last video I talked about how I inherited my brother's NES. And that's what I cut my teeth on, playing the likes of Super Mario Bros. I really had no concept of anything beyond my little gray box because I was still a kid and I I didn't have any subscriptions to any gaming magazines, and I mean, the internet wasn't a thing yet, so I just didn't really know any better. All of that changed on the day I went to a new babysitter's house after school. In addition to the familiar blocky NES, they had a sleeker gray box with rad purple accents. One of the other kids was playing a Mario game, but it was so much more vibrant than any other Mario game I had seen to that point. That's right, like so many other people, my first experience with the SNES was with Super Mario World, and I was just entranced with the sheer size of the game. Remember, the last Mario game I played at the time would have been Super Mario Bros. 3, which featured an overworld but also had rather short levels. Mario World returned to the longer level structure of the original game while retaining the larger interconnected overworld from Super Mario Bros. 3, an overworld that you could freely traverse back and forth on. You could play old levels to your heart's content, which was awesome. It actually made it feel like you were exploring a world. Over the following weeks, as I mostly watched other older children play while waiting for my turn, I was mystified when I saw other kids finding keys and keyhole exits, which in turn unlocked hidden paths and even hidden zones. So basically, there's two tiers of mainline Mario games. There's the first tier that's, you know, it's pretty good. They're solid games, they're fun, they're probably a cut above most other games, okay? Then there's the other tier. The Mamma Mia tier. The tier that has basically defined platforming for the last... I just hit a bottle of pills over. Let me try that again. A tier that has basically defined platformers for the last 30 years. Super Mario World easily falls into the Mamma Mia tier. That game is incredible. And I'll tell you what separates the two tiers. Basically, the Mamma Mia tier games are unrelenting, seemingly unending gauntlets of fresh ideas. See that giant bullet bill? Well, don't get too attached, because now here's Yoshi. You got him figured out? Too bad, mother effer, here's a cape. Figure that out. Now here's some enemies in bubbles. What the heck are they doing in bubbles? There's no time for that. Shut up. Now you're in the sunken remains of a flying ship that you destroyed in the last game, being pursued by the ghosts of the grunts that you so callously killed, with no thought whatsoever to the value of their life. Speaking of being a callous killer, do you see that exit? You know what has to be done. You monster. For a long time, that was pretty much the extent of my exposure to the Super Nintendo, until I met my friend, who, in this video, I'm gonna call Steve. Steve had a Super Nintendo and pretty much every major release for the system, and a lot of the obscure releases too. He basically had it all. I'd be lying if I said I didn't spend a lot of our time watching him play single-player games like, well, what we called Final Fantasy III at the time, and The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. Honestly though, he was still pretty good about making sure I had a turn at most of his single-player games, and we had a few two-player games that we played the ever-living crap out of. Chief among them were racing games. Now, one of the racing games that I remember most fondly was Uniracers. This game was developed by DMA Design. That's a company that would eventually evolve into a new company called Rockstar Games. The game featured anthropomorphized unicycles which raced and stunted their way through radical abstract tracks. The graphics were vibrant, the gameplay is silky smooth, and the soundtrack is just mwah. Anyways, this game is one of my favorites on the system. It's basically the only way to gain speed in this is to successfully pull off stunts. So it's actively rewarding you for doing the coolest things possible. It's just such a weird, surreal game. But here's the sad thing. I'm willing to bet that there's a fair number of you listening to this who really don't remember this game, which is a real shame because it's so incredible. And you know who you have to thank for that? Effing Pixar, everybody. You know, the company that makes fantastic animated the company that used to make incredible animated movies and now makes decent animated movies. See, in 1987, the company released a short called Red's Dream, which features a computer-animated unicycle relegated to the clearance corner of a deserted bicycle shop who dreams of one day being featured in a circus act. It's, well, it's early CGI, alright. I mean, taken in the context of being wholly computer generated in 1987, it's impressive. Now it looks a little strange. Actually, most early Pixar looks very strange and alarming, and oh, sweet, oh! Ugh. It would be a while before Pixar figured out how to animate humans without, you know, this happening. At any rate, after making Red's Dream, Pixar was apparently under the impression that they now own the rights to any and all computer-generated anthropomorphized unicycles. So when they saw DMA's Uniracers, which feature unicycles doing things like moving their seats as if they were heads, because what other part of a unicycle can you move to make it look like you have a head, they were having none of it, and they sued. Now, if there was a point in the game where the red unicycle stops and starts juggling, then maybe I could see this case having a leg to stand on. No, there's gotta be a unicycle joke in there. The case would have a wheel to balance on. That's disappointing. But they are engaged in completely different activities. One is a unicycle that wants to be in a circus, and one is simply unicycles racing each other. Anyway, the judge was a complete idiot and ruled in favor of Pixar, meaning that after the initial run of 300,000 copies, the game could no longer be sold. Thanks, Pixar. Now, the other major multiplayer game that we played a lot of is one that I'm sure many of you played a lot of, and that is Super Mario Kart. Many people credit Super Mario Kart with creating the kart racing genre, and that's not fair. Sega had released Power Drift in 1988, which actually, when you go back and look at it, it's pretty impressive. But the genre hadn't really been defined. And so yeah, Super Mario Kart kind of stepped in and defined that genre. Granted, with it being an early entry, it has some rough edges and doesn't quite have the level of polish that future Super Mario Kart games would have, but still, at the time it was the best kart racer we had, so we didn't know any better. And to be fair, this game developed the basic formula that has served Mario Kart for... Hold on, this can't possibly be right. Okay. Well, it served Mario Kart for the 29 years that have followed. That's depressing. Anyways, for the record, my main when playing this game has been and forever will be Donkey Kong Jr. Need to bring him back. Seriously though, we would race in the Grand Prix quite often, but our favorite mode of the game was easily battle mode, and that followed through with the game's sequel, Super Mario Kart 64. I love the battle sequences, being surrounded by balloons and you're trying to pop the balloons, it's a lot of fun. And the game has mode 7 thing, scrolling, it pretty damn sick, right? Now, after a year or so of spending most of my time playing the Super Nintendo at my babysitter's house or my friend Steve, I finally got a Super Nintendo of my own for Christmas. The bundle I got had Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World, so I'm thinking it had to be Christmas of sometime after '93. But for months, the only game I had was Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World. And I had played every one of these games already, but I feel like Nintendo put a lot of effort in remastering the old NES games to give them a new life. Honestly, it was a fantastic bundle because it was like having 5 games in one. Though, I have to be honest, I didn't play Lost Levels much. I'm gonna be honest, I got to the point where there were flying bloopers in the sky and my little literal mind was just like, nah, this is ridiculous. Okay, squids can't fly. I'm not playing this game. Also, it was really hard. I didn't beat that game till I was a grown man on the Wii U Virtual Console. But yeah, it's not like they just took the original NES games and just put them on the Super Nintendo. No, I mean, they redid all of the textures, they redid the soundtrack, they put a lot of effort into making these games look modern. Sure would be nice if Nintendo did that still, am I right? Effing Super Mario 3D All-Stars was a fetching joke. Now you can't even buy it. Come on, Nintendo. With it being the 90s, for the first year I had my Super Nintendo, I was doing a lot of game rentals. One game I remember renting way more than a normal kid should have was SimCity. Now you have to understand, my family wouldn't get a PC in my household until well into the Pentium era, meaning I didn't have regular access to the Maxis line of games. Only when I went to my grandma's house was I able to play them, so when I saw there was a version of SimCity and later SimAnt and SimEarth on the console, I rented them non-stop. SimCity for the SNES is actually my favorite version of the game, and it's for purely nostalgic reasons. For starters, Bowser's in the game. I mean, so that's incredible. He replaces the monster that attacks the city. But honestly, I think part of why I love that game so much is the soundtrack composed by Soyo Oka, who also composed the music for Super Mario Kart and Pilot Wings, by the way. The soundtrack just added so much to the game. There's just something so inviting about the music that plays as you begin planning your little village. And the Mr. Right theme, that song is just so damn happy. I sunk hours upon hours into SimCity. In fact, I can remember renting the cartridge and just praying my city had somehow not been deleted or changed. As you can imagine, that rarely happened, but the people of Fartston have an indomitable spirit. They cannot be held down. Like the phoenix of legend, Fartston will rise from the ashes from whence it burned, and become a beacon unto the world, a city on a hill, a city whose light cannot be hid under a bush. Anyways, the next games I remember adding to my collection that I actually bought, or rather that my mom actually bought for me, were the incredible and incredibly unforgiving Super Star Wars trilogy. Of the three games, my favorite was Empire Strikes Back, mainly due to the game's recreation of the Battle of Hoth. I distinctly remember thinking there would never be a better video game version of the Battle of Hoth. A few years later, a few more years later, a few more years later, a few more years later. Seriously though, these games were the best Star Wars games we had at the time. Sorry, let me rephrase that. These games were the best we plebs who didn't own PCs had at the time. My other favorite one was Return of the Jedi. What I love about the Return of the Jedi game is that it actually allowed you to pick characters. Not only that, you get to play as Wicket, which is, you know, a lot of fun. Do you want us to leave, buddy? Ugh. I also remember renting The Adventures of Indiana Jones quite a bit. It's kind of like the Super Star Wars trilogy, except that it's all three movies sunk into one game. I don't think it gets the credit that it deserves. It's a pretty fun game and a pretty good representation of Indiana Jones. And again, for plebs like me who didn't have a PC, this was the best Indiana Jones game I had access to. Plus, the game was actually developed by Factor 5, and that's a studio that we're going to be talking about quite a bit in my Generation 5 and 6 videos. Yeah, that's the thing. As a kid, I was drawn to licensed games. Because again, the early period of owning an SNES, I didn't have a subscription to Nintendo Power or really any gaming magazine. I didn't really have regular access to the internet, so there was no way for me to really judge which games were worth my time and not. And so when I would go to Blockbuster, I would typically default to games based on properties that I already knew and loved. And most of the time it didn't pan out right. Okay? For every Disney's Aladdin on the Super Nintendo, there was a Batman Forever. But I did want to go through a couple licensed games that I remember the most. I don't think fondly is the right word, but definitely the most clearly. So the first one was a fighting game. Now I wasn't much for fighting games, mostly because my mom wouldn't let me play them, but also because I just plain suck at them. Honestly, if you're expecting me to talk about Super Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat, you're gonna be a little bit disappointed. I didn't play those games a lot as a kid. I still don't play fighting games a lot. Really, the only fighting game that I enjoy is Super Smash Bros. I have immense respect for people that are good at fighting games. I really do. If you love fighting games, you are a much better gamer than I am. Although, interestingly enough, even though I wasn't a big fan of Mortal Kombat, it was such a big part of the zeitgeist that I was kind of a satellite fan of Mortal Kombat, you know? just ever present. So I still knew all of the characters, still saw the movie, and I gotta be honest, the theme to the adaptation of Mortal Kombat is like pure nostalgia. There is no other song from the 90s that will take me back faster to my childhood than the Mortal Kombat theme. It's just, it's got that perfect blend of 16-bit sound bites mixed with 90s EDM, and I think it played at every roller rink and arcade and party during the decade. That song takes me back. I've lost the thread. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, licensed games, fighting licensed games. Okay, so I didn't play many of them. One I do remember playing quite a bit of was Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the Fighting Edition. I guess because it was just giant robots fighting other giant monsters, my mom was okay with me playing the game. Now, I suck at these games, right? I've always sucked at these games. I'm always going to suck at these games. That being said, I do appreciate any fighting game that is forgiving enough for an idiot like me to play. And Perfect is a forgiving game. I was able to clear the campaign with no trouble. Of course, when I played with my friend Steve, he would wipe the floor with me, but that's okay. I do think my favorite aspect of the game was that you could pit your favorite Megazords against one another to see which one truly was the best. And of course, the answer to that question is the Thunder Megazord. Who else would it be? Look at this thing. Oh, he's so elegant. I also played the games that were based on the TV show and the movie. They're your standard beat-em-ups. They're fun, they're fine, but they're nothing really special. Not like, perfect. That game was there's even a secret battle against Ivan Ooze, which was really cool. That's a cool game, man. Power Rangers was cool. What a cool show. Do you guys know that in the Japanese version of the original Power Rangers, the Yellow Ranger was a male? And in some scenes, when he crouches just right, you can tell that it's a male in the Yellow Ranger suit. So, moving on. Speaking of beat-em-ups, that kind of seemed to be the genre of choice when making games based on superheroes. One of my favorites was The Adventures of Batman and Robin. I feel like the SNES graphics chip and its color palette were really well suited to capturing the aesthetic of the incredible Batman the Animated Series. Plus, it featured some pretty darn satisfying gameplay. And look, did the game do a really great job of capturing what it's like to be Batman? No, not particularly. But then what game really had at that point? We were still a good 15 years away from the seminal Arkham Asylum, so this and Batman Returns for the Super Nintendo and Batman on the NES, they were the best I had at the time, and it was certainly better than the piece of guano that was Batman Forever, the game, but also the movie. Both were pieces of guano. My favorite superhero game on the system was easily Maximum Carnage. I mean, just look at this cartridge. It's red, just like Carnage is. This is the kind of thing that kids in the 90s lost their minds over. That's so cool. It's based on the story arc of the same name. Remember, this was 1994, which means Carnage was the newest, most exciting addition to Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery. You also got to play as Venom, who happened to be one of my favorite comic book characters at the time because he was so edgy. And the game itself, like the gameplay, Now when I go back and play it, what really sets the game apart is its awesome soundtrack, which was provided by Green Jelly. That music slaps. I hate that I said that. That doesn't feel natural coming out of my mouth. Like I mentioned, there was also Batman Returns, which I enjoyed, and The Death of Superman, and Turtles in Time, which was an incredible beat-em-up. I remember all of those pretty fondly, but beat-em-ups were never really my favorite genre. Come to think of it, with Death of Superman, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Why are these idiots able to hurt Superman in the beginning? One of the other licensed games that I remember playing a lot, I bought it used as a kid with my own money, and it was the Animaniacs game. That game looks really cool. It's such a fun aesthetic, but the gameplay is so repetitive and so frustrating. And it doesn't even compare to the Animaniacs game on the Sega Genesis, so I'm gonna talk more about it when I talk about the Sega Genesis. But if we're gonna be talking about licensed games, we have to talk about the games that Disney licensed out. Because Disney games on the SNES were legit, man. Because Disney was on their A game with their video games in the 90s. I mean, I guess the best place to start if we're talking about Disney games is where it all started, with the mouse. And he had a couple really great titles on the system. Nothing that quite matched his outings on the Sega Genesis, but still a couple quite good ones. The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse was was one of the earlier Disney games on the system, coming out in 1992. Personally, never owned a copy of the game, but I rented it enough that I played it all the way through. I love the feel of this game. Something about the graphics mixed with all the magical abilities unlocked throughout the game was just, for lack of a better word, it was just magical. It's got that classic Capcom feel too, with the soft music and sound effects, and I don't know. As a kid, it really managed to capture Disney magic on the Super Nintendo, which was a lot of fun. The other major release on the system that I remember playing quite well was the one made by Traveler's Tales, and it was, you could argue, a better Mickey Mouse game. It came out in 1995 and it was called Mickey Mania. The game is basically set in a whole bunch of iconic Mickey Mouse shorts, and with it being such a late game in the system's life, it looks absolutely gorgeous. The game plays a little bit frustrating and iffy, but I feel like that's kind of par for the course for platformers at the time. This was still very much in the era when a game's longevity came from practicing and getting good enough at the game to progress. Back when I was a kid and could sink hours upon hours replaying the same level. Of course, on top of that, Disney movies got some pretty fantastic games as well. The Lion King's adaptation was pretty fun. I swear I spent 70% of my time playing this game trying to get past the just can't wait to be king level. You stupid monkeys, just throw me where I want you to throw me! But the king of all Disney licensed games on the SNES had to be Beauty and the Beast. I mean, obviously the action-packed plot of the film was ripe for making a video game out of. In the game itself, the platforming is just so perfect. The level design is flawless. Really, the snowball catching stage, it's nothing short of a revelation. Okay, I can't do this. Obviously, the best Disney licensed game on the SNES, for my money at least, is Aladdin. For much of the 90s, Aladdin was my favorite Disney movie. The humor, which is in large part bolstered by the always incredible Robin Williams, the action and the pure fantasy of the film just drew me in. What amazes me about Aladdin is the fact that it got two very different adaptations on the Genesis and the SNES, made by Virgin Interactive and Capcom respectively, and both of them are fantastic games in their own right. Usually when there's a Genesis version and an SNES version of a game, there is one that I definitively prefer. For instance, I much prefer the Genesis version of Earthworm Jim to the SNES version. Not just because the SNES is missing a level, I actually prefer the way it plays on the Genesis. I also like the music and color palette on the Genesis version. It's actually why, by the way, Earthworm Jim isn't being mentioned in this retrospective. I'd much rather talk about the version that I prefer. Of course, the best version of that game is the version that was on the Sega CD, but I mean, who had a Sega CD?
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD?
No.
Anyways, with Aladdin, the games are different enough that they become their own beasts, and I love both of them for different reasons. The SNES version is a classic Capcom platformer through and through. Unlike the Genesis version, which gives the main character a sword, the game employs a more traditional method of dispatching enemies. You jump on them. My gosh, does it feel good. The animation mixed with the sound design makes each and every kill so god-dang satisfying. And the music, man. That sort of synthy symphonic music that you get on the SNES is just magical. Even the original pieces, like the Cave of Wonders, just listen to this. Just mwah. It's another chef's kiss. There's probably gonna be more. Now we're going to talk about the big boys. We're going to talk about the masterpieces. We're going to talk about the games that when I think of the SNES, they're the first games I think of, with the exception of Super Mario World, because we've already talked about that earlier. And the first game we're going to talk about in this category isn't a game at all. It's Mario Paint. Mario Paint is such a unique idea. I remember renting it many times. And it was awesome because it came with a mouse and a really weird plastic mouse pad. And really, what it was a chance for a child to dip their toes in digital content creation. Paint things, you could color things, you could make pixel art, you could make music, you could make animation. All of it gave kids a chance to do something that on a computer system would be really, really expensive. Now, I'll be honest, for myself, I was not a very creative child. So mainly I spent most of my time in the Music Maker, messing around with all the different sound effects, and also playing the coffee break game, which was, the fly swatting game, which was awesome. But I would have friends, I would watch them create works of art, and it was a lot of fun. The biggest contribution that Mario Paint made to my life, though, was the contribution it made to the life of the brothers Chaps, the creators of Homestar Runner. Mario Paint is where they did their first Homestar Runner animations. So we maybe wouldn't have had that without Mario Paint, which is reason enough for me to love it. Now obviously we were still in the 16-bit era, which meant that platformers were still the pretty much undisputed king of genres. One of my favorite platformers from that era is Super Castlevania 4. Unlike other Castlevania games, this game gave you full control over Simon's Whip, which may sound like a trivial thing, but once you have it and you have to go back to the games where you don't, you miss it. And it was just so detailed and atmospheric. Just that music that plays at the title screen gets you sucked in, and it's such a beautifully crafted game. It was my favorite Castlevania game, and yes, that includes Symphony of the Night.
Time, monster! You don't belong in this world!
Up until very recently, when I finally had a chance to play Rondo of Blood, and I think I like Rondo of Blood a little bit more than Super Castlevania. Castlevania is a 2D scroller, there's nothing better, and I feel like Super Castlevania 4 is where they perfected the classic Castlevania formula. Again, I love Symphony of the Night, but it isn't the simple sort of linear experience with tight platforming that the classic Castlevania games are. Of course, when we talk about platformers on the SNES, we can't neglect to talk about Rareware's trilogy, Donkey Kong Country. When the original Donkey Kong Country was about to come out, I remember my friend got a VHS that was like Donkey Kong Country Exposed. It's a trip to watch now. It is a very 90s video, but it got us pumped. I mean, the main selling point that I can remember talking to my friends about more than anything else was the fact that the graphics for Donkey Kong Country were created with the same computers that brought the dinosaurs to life in Jurassic Park. I mean, my gosh. Talk about an easy way to get a kid in the 90s excited about something. Now, in actuality, what they had done is they rendered the character models with Silicon graphics machines, and then ultimately compressed those images so that they could fit on the Super Nintendo. But it still looks incredible. And you have to remember that Donkey Kong Country came out right around the same time that Sega was gearing up to release the Saturn and that Sony had released the PlayStation in Japan. But Donkey Kong Country gave the Super Nintendo a shot in the arm and kept it alive for a couple more years. It definitely showed that this system still had plenty of life left in it. That's something that the SNES, the strategy that Nintendo had chosen to take, was this idea that you could build custom chips in the cartridges that would expand the Super Nintendo's capabilities. That meant that you could make more complex and better games as the years went by that could go beyond what a stock SNES could do. And Donkey Kong Country is a great example of that. I'll be honest, I like the original Donkey Kong Country just fine. I like the third Donkey Kong Country a lot too. It's definitely a different feel than the first two games, and I feel bad. I feel like the game kind of got left in the dust because it came out right as everybody was getting hyped for the Nintendo 64. It also had horrible commercials.
Something you wouldn't expect.
Ugh. But if we're talking about Donkey Kong Country, if we're talking about classic Donkey Kong platforming action, neither the first game nor the third come anywhere close to the majesty that is Diddy's Conquest, Donkey Kong Country 2. I mean, that is Rareware at their finest and most inventive. And it starts out on a pirate ship, and that first world is all pirate themed, and each world that comes after that has unique themes. At one point you're in a beehive, at another point you're in a dilapidated amusement park riding a roller coaster. It's just, it's so fun. I mean, this is kind of where Rare started going a little bit overboard with their collectibles and games, but even still, the levels, it's worth replaying and trying to discover things you missed because the levels are just that much fun. And the soundtrack, oh my gosh, you guys, David Wise, I mean, do we even have to talk about Sticker Brush Symphony? It's just a beautiful piece of music, although for my money, I'm all about Mining Melancholy. That is just mwah. Okay, I gotta stop with the chef's kisses. I'm sorry, it's getting old, I know. Now, another big genre at the time that unfortunately was pretty underrepresented, in my opinion, on the Super Nintendo was shooters. Not first-person shooters, shoot-em-ups. The problem is that many of the shoot-em-ups that came to the SNES, they just ran slow, man. Slowdown was a big issue that you would run into. But the shoot 'em up that I do remember sinking a lot of hours into, even though it did have that problem, was UN Squadron. UN Squadron was based on an anime and manga that I had no idea about in the 90s, but the game was incredible. Unlike most shoot 'em ups at the time where one hit you're done, you can get hit and your life bar goes all the way down, which means another hit's gonna finish you off. But if you avoid being hit long enough, you'll gain some of that life bar back. So it's a little bit forgiving, which is great, again, for noobs like me. But it also allows you, between levels, to spend money that you earn upgrading your plane, buying new planes, getting new weapons. It's just a fantastic game. The music's incredible. It's got such a good rock and roll sound to it. It's a fantastic shoot 'em up, and it's probably my favorite shoot 'em up on the system, the one that I remember playing the most. Okay, now we gotta talk about an elephant in the room, and that is RPGs. I was not a fan of RPGs until I was a little bit older than I was during the lifespan of the Super Nintendo. Not until my teens did I really start to like RPGs. But the first RPG that ever got me interested in the genre was one that probably got a lot of Westerners interested in the genre, and that is Super Mario RPG. Such an incredibly weird pairing that'll probably never happen again between Nintendo and Square Enix. And what's interesting is, going back and playing it now, having played many other classic turn-based RPGs, it's amazing how well this game holds up. It's certainly a little bit easier than your Final Fantasy, but it is definitely got depth. On top of that, this was one of the first Mario games, I would say was the first Mario game, that really introduced incredible humor and incredible world building, that created this world that was fun to explore with characters that you came to love. And I mean, that humor that you saw in Super Mario RPG translated well into Paper Mario and Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door. And look guys, as much as I hate to admit it, that humor is present in a lot of the modern Paper Marios. But yeah, this game was fantastic, and it was, again, the first game that really made me understand, oh, this is what this is about. This is an epic journey. It's fun to play a game where you can grow and equip new things and make your character stronger. So it was a really important game for me. And also, again, the soundtrack to that game. It's just beautiful. Speaking of RPGs on the SNES, this is a blind spot for me, because the SNES had some incredible RPGs. One of the most incredible, obviously, is Final Fantasy VI. What we called Final Fantasy III at the time. I watched my friend play through a good chunk of that game, and I'm familiar with the story of that game. But it's time to announce one of my greatest shames. I struggle with Final Fantasy games. I don't think I've ever completed a Final Fantasy game. See, what ends up happening is I'll get 5 or 10 hours into the campaign, and then either I will get distracted or busy with something else, and then be distracted by that for a few weeks, and then when you try to go back to play the game, you're kind of lost story-wise and it's hard to get back into, or I will just flat out lose interest. With Final Fantasy III, it's just bad luck. I've just gotten distracted every time I've tried to play that game. It's a great, wonderful game for the 10 hours that I've played and for the story that I've seen, but I don't know. I don't know what it is about Final Fantasy. I struggle getting through those games. But fear not, Square. You do have a game on the SNES that is one of my all-time favorite games, and that, of course, is Chrono Trigger. If you have not played Chrono Trigger, what the hell are you doing? You need to play it. It is the best RPG, turn-based RPG, in my humble opinion. The story is engrossing. The choices you make have consequences later in the game. It was one of the first games that had the multiple endings type shtick, but more importantly, every single member of your party is a character that you grow to care about and love. And every single character in your party has a story and a character arc that is very, very compelling. I don't want to spoil too much, I really don't, because if you haven't played this game, you need to. The battle system is engaging. I love the fact that many of your special moves change depending on the makeup of your party. You depend on other members of your party to do team special moves. It's just such a well-crafted game. I'll be honest, I do prefer playing it on the DS just because you do get the enhancements like the animated interludes, but it is also very, very fun to play on the SNES as well. It's a real shame that they didn't include it on the SNES Classic, although there are ways you can get it on there. There's another RPG on the Super Nintendo that I absolutely loved, but much like the platformer I'm saving until the very end, I didn't play it until I was an adult, so we're gonna get to it in just a minute. Let's talk about Zelda, because it's kind of an RPG, I guess. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is not a game that I completed until after I had played The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. See, I had seen my friend playing A Link to the Past in the lead up to the release of Ocarina of Time, but it didn't really draw me in. I didn't get it, I guess you could say. And then I played Ocarina of Time, and that blew my mind. So I went back and played A Link to the Past. And by this point, I was getting into Tolkien, so I had read The Hobbit, and I was reading The Lord of the Rings. And what's interesting about A Link to the Past, you do still have the foundations of the Hyrulean mythology. You've got Hylians, you've got the Seven Sages, you've got the Master Sword, you've got Ganondorf's origin, the Triforce, all of that, but it doesn't quite have the full Zelda flavor yet. You've still got dwarves in the game that help improve the Master Sword. It just hit something in my brain in a way that no other game really has. Hey guys, this is Josh in the editing bay. I don't have an editing bay. I'm editing, okay? And I just wanted to take a minute to stop and point out that the reason that this probably resonated with me so much while I was reading Tolkien is because A Link to the Past was directed by Takeshi Tezuka, who is a fan of the Tolkien books. So that makes a heck of a lot of sense, especially since right around the time of Ocarina of Time, that's when Eiji Aonuma sort of took over as the director of the Zelda games, and so it would make sense that they didn't quite have that same Lord of the Rings-ish kind of flair to them. That's a theory anyway. A game theory. Thanks for... Sorry, I had a little mat pat in my throat. And it's for that reason that A Link to the Past remains my second favorite Zelda game of all time. Also, to this day, one of my favorite video game music pieces is The Lost Woods. It just does such a good job of capturing the mystique and the mystery, and I love it. There was also Star Fox, which is fine. I like Star Fox just fine. Another one of my favorite games is F-Zero, which is weird because racing games, like real fast racing games, are not usually my jam. But F-Zero it's just fun. It's incredible that this is a launch title. I think of the launch titles, that would have been the game that you bought to show off the power of your new system. You know, it had that Mode 7 scaling, and the music is just fantastic. The action is smooth and fast, and Nintendo, what the hell are you doing? Why have we not had an F-Zero Hold on, let me look it up. Nintendo, what are you doing? Why have we not had an F-Zero since 2004? It's been 17 years. The hell? Just make an F-Zero, please. But there is one game that, as a kid, I loved more than any other game on the Super Nintendo. A game that I played over and over and over again. And that game is Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. A game so weird and odd and counter to everything that was going on during the time that it was released that you can't help but not love it. So you gotta remember, this was pretty much the end of the Super Nintendo's lifespan in North America. And Nintendo was trying to be as extreme and edgy as possible because that's what the kids were into. And so suddenly here's this game that looks like it was drawn by crayons about babysitting. It also has a very disgusting commercial.
When is too much too much? To find out, we crammed everything into Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. 60 more levels, massive enemies, huge Yoshi tricks, all served up with the latest graphic technology, Morphmation.
No more.
Sure you don't have room for another little bonus level? Super Mario World 2, only on the Super NES. Still the big one.
From what I understand, behind the scenes, Nintendo wanted Shigeru Miyamoto to create a Mario game that looked like Donkey Kong, that had that 3D rendering. And Shigeru Miyamoto had other ideas. He certainly created something unique. Guys, this is editing Josh again, and I'm an idiot. I don't know what I was thinking when I said that it was Shigeru Miyamoto who made the decision that they shouldn't use Donkey Kong's visuals. I mean, maybe he had a part in it. He was a producer on the game. But more likely than not, it was probably Takeshi Tezuka or Shigefumi Hino or any of the other directors on the game that made that decision. I'm really starting to think I need to do a video on Takeshi Tezuka because I feel like he is a man that's responsible for a lot of my fondest gaming memories as a child. And I didn't even know it. All the games that he directed, like A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Yoshi's Island, he helped on Super Mario 64, I kind of always just attributed those to Miyamoto himself. And I think Tezuka had a pretty active role in all those games. Anyways, well, bye. I mean, not bye. There's still a little bit left of the video. Kudos to you if you've made it this long. This is turning into a long video. It's just pain in the ass to edit. Okay. But very different from Donkey Kong Country. What's interesting is the game still is visually very technically taxing because you've got all of these different layers and there is so much detail in each of the levels and there is still 3D rendering on certain objects. So it's still a very technically advanced game that I don't think could have been done at the beginning of the Super Nintendo's lifespan. But the game, it just has so many memorable moments. From fighting a boss inside the boss's own stomach, to fighting a boss on the moon, to doing drugs maybe, to making sure that this baby gets to its place safely, and that baby's gonna grow up and repay you by jumping off of you and letting you fall to your death. It's a beautiful cycle of life. No, seriously, the platforming on this game is so airtight. And unlike Super Mario World, they've taken the timer away, which definitely encourages, exploring each of the levels. I also feel like it has the perfect balance of collectibles. Each level has 20 red coins. You want to have 30 stars, which are basically your hit points at the end of the level, and 5 flowers to gather. And if you gather all, you get 100% on the course. And that's the perfect balance, where you're still having to explore the levels, and there are going to be some levels that on your first try you're not going to get everything, but you can go back and get them, and it's not overbearing like some of the Donkey Kong collectibles became. It really is, in my opinion, the Super Nintendo swan song. It is the culmination of everything that the Super Nintendo could do. It is magic, pure and simple. But there are 2 games that I would not play until well into my adulthood. One of those games I rented. By started, I mean I turned it on and got to the title screen, turned it off. and was like, nope, not playing that. And then the GameCube came out and I played Metroid Prime. And after playing that, I wanted to go back and play Super Metroid. And when I did, sorry, I wasn't an adult. I don't know why I said that. I was a teenager. Anyways, when I did go back and play it, I found pretty much the most perfectly tuned platforming game that I think may have ever been made. There's video essays out there talking about how the level design of Super Metroid is so perfect that it allows for a player to find things that they can't get to, but they're easy enough to remember that when they get what they need to get to whatever they couldn't get to, they can get to it. That didn't make any sense, but what I'm trying to say here is the game encourages backtracking, but the backtracking never feels tedious. It manages to make backtracking feel rewarding, because as you get more things, you unlock more things, and you feel progress, which is exactly what you want to feel in an adventure game. Love Super Metroid. But the last game, it's a game that stuck with me in ways that very few games have. And that is Earthbound. Earthbound is a weird game. Its off-kilter sense of humor, mixed in with its surreal and sometimes frightening world, makes for a memorable experience, to say the least. But as funny and weird and off-kilter as the game is, it also has an immense amount of heart. I don't want to spoil the story in case you haven't played Earthbound, but let's just say there's some big surprises that have some pretty heartfelt messages to go along with them. It's a game that I played in my early 20s when I felt kind of lost, didn't quite know what I wanted to do with my life, and I remember playing through the game for the first time on an emulator, because this was back before Nintendo had released it in any form on any virtual console. So to get it on eBay was like $230, $300. The gameplay itself is nothing special. I mean, I would say Final Fantasy, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, really any other JRPG on the system has more robust systems, but none of them are Earthbound. No other game has managed to capture that magic, with the exception of Mother 3. I mean, the game is just a passion project by Shigesato Itoi, and you can feel that. You can feel a very real voice in the game, and that's just not something you get very often in video games, especially now. Another side note to the game that makes it even more special to me now is the fact that it never would have been released without Satoru Iwata stepping in and basically saving the game by recoding large patches of it. God bless that man, I miss him. That's a downer note. Anyways, guys, I hope I've earned a like from you, at the very least. Or if this video has been trash, I hope it's earned a dislike. Go ahead and leave that as well. I'd also like to hear comments from you guys about what your favorite Super Nintendo games are. What are the games that you remember most fondly from the era? Let me know. Watch out for the Sega Genesis retrospective. Which probably won't take another year, I hope. And I love you guys a lot. Thanks for watching or listening, or I don't effing know.